So we don't have that much time, and this is actually a conversation that's begun to happen very organically over the past few days. But as you've begun to realize, as we're talking about sharding, and as you've maybe read the spec, things are going to change a lot. We're still narrowing down on some of the details, but the difference between Eth1.0 and Eth2.0 are huge, and the links, at least in the immediate foreseeable future, between the two there's not that many links. Like, there's ways to get into this new system, but not necessarily ways to talk to this old system. So in that respect, there are a lot of things to think about beyond just the core design of the protocol. And this room is full of people that it's going to be very important that you begin to think about these problems. Firstly, the clients kind of sit at the center of this ecosystem, and everything else kind of ripples outwards. You have your clients, you have your Web3 and your tooling, you have your languages, et cetera, et cetera. You have your dApps, your contracts. And so the decisions that you make and the ways that you channel your resources and move forward over the next chunk of time are going to make everyone's jobs outside of that harder or easier. So first of all, the first kind of thing that comes to mind is clients, right? So we are going to have this idea of an EVM legacy client and a shard client. And they can either be one and the same, or a client could support both, a client could support one or the other. So we have things we need to start thinking about in terms of is my client this or that? If I'm an up-and-coming client, do I focus my efforts on sharding and then maybe add legacy support in the future? If I'm an existing client, do I focus my efforts on keeping the EVM strong, letting other people experiment, and then moving into the sharding landscape? And then from there, we have Web3, the way people interface with the chain. Are we making the way that people have to conceive of these two systems? There's a lot of design decisions there into the interfaces that we expose. Do they have to think about these two different landscapes? Do we have two separate modules, or do we have kind of a unified language to talk to both of these systems so that the user doesn't have to think about it? And we have the contract languages. These guys are working on Yule, which is going to allow Solidity to begin to compile into WASM. We were talking already, Viper and some of these other languages, maybe should consider moving towards the standard. Maybe there should be some sort of EIP to standardize Yule and try to promote Yule. Then we have kind of then we started moving more and more into the user area. We have existing contracts, we have existing dApps. How do we manage these complexities? Then the kind of big thing, one of the largest contracts we have, or one of the largest things we have on Ethereum right now, for better or for worse, are all these token contracts. What do they do? There's definitely not exactly one answer. It's probably depends on what their community, what they're doing with their community and what their token actually does, all that kind of stuff. But things that we need to start thinking about, and then just kind of the narrative and the user experience in general. Like, we have a lot of people that are involved in some level in this community. What is the narrative moving to Eth2.0, and how do we kind of capture the community and bring everyone over the next chunk of time? Anyway, those are just the large problems as I see them. And as I said, we've begun to have that conversation organically, but we have some time now if we want to talk about anything in particular. I'm sure a lot of the research team has thought about some of these things. I know the WASM guys, the language guys, people are starting to think about these problems, so it's a good time for people to chat. So I don't actually have a question to pose.
So one thing that I've been thinking about, I got mildly worried when we were like, okay, full Casper instead of hybrid Casper, just from a messaging standpoint. And so then I started like looking into the full Casper and I kind of feeling it out, and it feels like basically we are taking those old Casper messages and we're kind of adding more information, and that more information is bootstrapping this beacon chain. And so I feel like an important part of at least that part of the messaging, which is I think only the first bit of this like larger picture of messaging where we talk about, you know, EWASM and the EVM, I think that's going to be another whole challenge. But basically saying, you know, we're doing this hybrid Casper thing, but then we realize that at the same time as we build on this hybrid proof of work, proof of stake chain, we can also start bootstrapping a full proof of stake chain so that we can like kind of very easily transition from hybrid to full and not just be stuck on hybrid forever. So anyway, this is something that I've been thinking about and I think somewhat reasonable.
I know the Nimbus guys were talking today. We were talking briefly. It's just like, does Nimbus at this point focus their efforts on sharding, or do you focus your efforts on building an EVM client? I mean, have you had more thoughts on that as you've explored the information available?
Yeah, there's a dependency problem in there. Like, in order to do beacon chain, you need to do a lot of the stuff that's already on Ethereum 1.
Right, I mean,
from the perspective of somebody starting really from zero, and we're using a new language, we're building the hash primitives, we're building the networking, we're building all kinds of things, right? So all that is equal. On the other hand, we feel that we have an opportunity to work on the sharding from the perspective of somebody that's going to bring it to the masses of mobile phones, to really pushing this angle of the project. And there's a lot of valuable experience to be had for us, but I also think for the Ethereum community to contribute to this process, right? So it's not much of an answer. I don't know, Zahra, you want to add something to that?
Not much. I mean, we decided that we will start to follow the development closely. We will try to participate with ideas, with concerns. But of course, during this time, we just have to deliver a fully compatible Ethereum 1 implementation, because Nimbus, you previously asked, it should support both networks when it is released. It should work with the legacy chain and the sharded chains.
One more thing is that we do have a timeline in mind, and that timeline revolves a little bit around resources, hiring, and so on, but like tentatively we're looking to come out with a working client towards the end of the year, and we're looking to start working on sharding right now in parallel, right? So there's a bit of balance, and a big outcome of like us being here at this conference is getting a feel for the maturity of the various research projects that are going on. What of it we can implement and benefit from, and what is still so much in flux that there's really not much for us to do there. So I mean, that's what we're here for, to figure
right.
out also.
At this point, it's almost like it's time to start thinking, but for a lot of the components of the system, it's not necessarily time to start developing immediately.
So if we don't develop, should we do some kind of proof of concept to show if it works, or if it don't, or so that we can discuss?
Absolutely. There's kind of a Python proof of concept going on right now. The guys at Prismatic Labs are putting together a proof of concept. I know there's a lot of work in the P2P layer that should probably be worked on now, and is kind of needs to exist regardless of the final implementation layer on top. I know the research team is kind of keen on the P2P, but that's still an open discussion.
I'd actually throw that question right back. Like, what's an ideal plan for a newcomer client? According to the experience of the people that are in this room right now, that are like have the benefit of experience.
Wait, what's
What's the ideal plan for a newcomer right now, according to the research team? For a newcomer.
For a new client, you know, right now is a strange limbo. If I decided to develop a client a year from now, I think it would be sharding first. Like, I would start working on a sharding client, and then if I chose to support the EVM, we should come up with the right term for it. I know there was some pushback on legacy chain, but to support EVM 1.0 chain, that would be kind of a secondary thing. But right now, we're in a limbo where I think if you're ready to put the pedal to the metal on a client, it's like build EVM 1.0. But there's also an opportunity to be a prominent sharding client, because if you're involved right now, you can kind of be on the cutting edge and be kind of have the information and get in there early, get to users early. So.
It's almost what I was going to say about the limbo. It's from my feeling, like from what I could see, is that the existing Ethereum clients are kind of living in a permanent state of crisis at the moment, because there's certain thresholds which are now being reached in terms of the capacity of the. I'm not talking about all the client, all the like terrible. You know, you've heard about this. This hysterical thing about reaching the terabyte limit and stuff like this. And still, every week there's some messages coming on, like what's happening with the network, is it like gas prices going up again? So it creates the feeling that we're living in this permanent crisis mode, and that again translates into most of the developers on the current teams, unfortunately, are bogged down with the maintenance of the existing clients. So they can't really spend a lot of time looking into sharding, and they're trying to avoid that situation where they've been working on the sharding for like half a year, and then the whole thing changed again, and it's like, oh, well, what about now, right? What are we going to do now? So I think a lot of them would postpone this work until it's like the very last stage. Is that, oh, you know, they're still figuring these things out. If we start implementing it now, it's just like we might need to completely rewrite this stuff again. And another thing I was going to say is that in this, usually in the software engineering, if you decide to rewrite something, like I see the sharding is completely rewrite of the Ethereum, the important thing to do is that to also change the way you do software engineering, because otherwise you're going to just write the same thing, right? You have to change your practices around how you develop, how you test, how you ship. Otherwise, you'll get exactly the same problem as before. Like, you might start living in a permanent crisis again.
So in that respect, you might, if I had a new client and I had the resources, I could have guys working on EVM 1.0, I have another team working on sharding, and keep them actually like kind of isolated, because as the EVM 1.0 client kind of, like actually reaches mainnet, like you're probably going to start putting out fires. Like, it's just going to like consume more and more resources.
I just wanted to express that we're kind of struggling with this a little bit in the EWASM world as well. So obviously, up to this point, EWASM has been designed to be 100% EVM compatible. Way back, kind of the original roadmap was for it to sort of replace EVM on the main chain. That's not the case anymore. And so this is a question we've been asking ourselves a lot. Like, should we feel a bit like we have our hands tied by this EVM compatibility question, and there's a lot of things that we would change or redesign. We've sort of begun this conversation. What does EWASM 2.0 look like? Now as we begin to approach sort of a proof of concept of having EWASM sort of 1.0 working, should we break out a little bit from the EVM mindset? Are there, you know, like just as one concrete example, like we're up to now, we've been trying to match the gas pricing. We have been matching the gas pricing exactly one for one, and so we can pass all the existing state tests and stuff, but that may actually be a waste of our time. And I guess if EWASM code is never going to have to talk to EVM code, then you know, maybe we don't need to be perfectly compatible.
It seems like the signal is that you don't, but at the same time, there's good in starting from scratch, but there's also that implies time. So you have to.
So should we split our team in half too, and have half do EVM compatible and half?
Yeah, just everyone split in two, and put on blinders and.
We don't have the resources.
Well, that's actually one of the big points is like we have finite resources, we have finite like kind of effort and time, and so it's making these decisions. I don't have the answers. I don't think anyone in this room has the answers, but there is going to be a separation of concerns and time and effort and capital. So be aware of that and make decisions accordingly, and have someone on your team following this research and like to be able to help make decisions about the direction things are going, and to be able to pitch into the conversation. The like high-level mechanics are getting in place, but there are a lot of details, especially when you bring in the execution engine, as to like how all these things are going to work. And depending on your team, you have some very valuable expertise.
So, Danny, actually, we have a solution for you. You don't need to split people. There's this thing called EVM to WASM. So you only need to have the sharding client with WASM. And you can use this compiler which compiles EVM to WASM, and you can run it on WASM. And this goes back to what Lane has mentioned on matching gas prices. But to be clear, it's not about being compatible with the EVM on the sense of WASM code talking to EVM code. For that, we don't need like 100% match of gas costs. The only reason we need that, at least for now, if you want to keep this EVM to WASM gadget. And there were like two reasons we have been working on EVM to WASM. One of them is to provide this clean slate of a client if you only have a WASM-based client, but you still want to support the main chain. But secondly, what we actually use it for, because nobody wants to write tests at all. And there was a decision, well, except Dimitri. But we couldn't hijack Dimitri for EWASM, because he's like the only person writing tests for Ethereum. And so there was a decision that we could just step into the work Dimitri is doing and use the state tests. And to do that, we have used EVM to WASM. But we just don't have enough resources to like keep it up to date. As you mentioned, we would need to split a couple of people. And that's one of the questions we actually have. What should be the future of EVM to WASM, or whether this concept makes sense? I'm not sure where to ask that, but...
So can I complain a little bit about EVM to WASM? I think there are more contracts that rely on gas than maybe people expect, and particularly it's going to break one of my contracts, and I'm not too happy about it. So.
Yeah.
The use case of EVM to WASM, other than having your state test run, is that was in an effort to actually be able to run WASM and EVM side by side, correct?
It was kind of like a failed effort to avoid writing native tests. The original effort was to provide the opportunity for having a clean EWASM client, where you wouldn't have to write an EVM code, EVM interpreter or whatever. So you would just run everything on WASM, and you would have this tool to take care of the legacy code.
And it was for deploying EWASM on main chain.
Yeah, I mean, the assumption was that it wasn't going to be next to the EVM on the main chain. But that doesn't mean that you need this tool, because the clients already have EVM. So you could just put EWASM next to it. It was really just about having like a clean implementation if you just want to get rid of EVM entirely, but still support the old contracts.
And does that have, in a landscape where you have sharding entirely with WASM, it doesn't really have a place in that landscape, does it?
Well, if you get like Viper and Solidity to compile to WASM directly, then probably there's not too much need for it.
So I was gonna offer a solution, but that requires to go back on some of the roadmap decisions that I've made before, even go back to 2017. Because I think Vitalik was talking at DevCon 3 about this new roadmap where we're going to keep the
the existing chain pretty static in terms of functionality and start building things on the side. But I start having doubts about it because I think we end up actually splitting the developers into two groups. The ones that are maintaining the current clients are kind of super busy and they can't fork off the people for the sharding and Casper research. And now we have a group of people who are doing sharding Casper research, but they're only writing the prototypes. And so how do we not do that and just take everybody together to the end goal? And maybe we have to split up this roadmap into smaller chunks and integrate them, if it's possible at all. And that's because it does have a value. It might be harder, but it does have a value.
Right, and, oh yeah, please.
I think probably one of the hardest parts is going to be that like EVM, EWASM transition. I think like from the developer side, that is definitely super hard. From a like protocol side, I would say that the like Casper FFG / beacon chain stuff shouldn't be too radical from a user perspective. And so that's definitely like a unambiguously very good first step. At least so far I have not felt ambiguity there. But then when it gets into like, okay, how do we do cross-shard communication? How do we like bring contracts down to the shards? How do we actually like, bring ETH to the shards? That's when it's like a lot more ambiguous. And hopefully, I mean, that's why I definitely think, as you said, breaking it into small chunks and making sure that at each time we have a kind of clear story for why that is the next step. And like why it's a manageable chunk and why it's still kind of core Ethereum canon.
But at some point you're going to have a new execution engine in a totally new landscape, and like at that point you have kind of schism where you are either working in the old landscape or you're working in the new landscape. And at that hurdle, like you have to somehow bring the whole community over.
If some of you worked in the kind of big organizations with lots of software developers, you probably witnessed that situation where there was an existing system which worked that actually made money, and then there was this team working on it, and then they bring the new people to work on the new version, and either of two things can happen. So they diverge really quite a lot, and so either the new team gets fired, and then the whole thing gets scrapped because they never managed to actually implement this, or magically somehow they managed to pull the existing product into the new version. So they realize that they need the full potential, the whole team, to pull it off. They can't just do like, we do this thing on the side and you keep doing that old thing. You have to get everybody together and pull it off.
I think that's also, there's a lot of people want to talk. That's one reason I think a lot of these like proto clients have the opportunity of supporting EVM 1.0 and starting to put out fires and having issues with like getting a robust client in the new zone. But that's, internal team decision. There's a lot of people who want to talk.
I think the Python implementation are maybe the only one that we actually seamlessly implement the PyVM 1.0 and 2.0 altogether. And I don't know how Piper has much time to do that. He's amazing. And I do hope that more the client maintainer, please take a look at that. Pay some time for the sharding research, and I don't know. Maybe it's because the Eastern Foundation we have some resource to do that, but we do need more researchers and devs to pay attention on the P2P next generation P2P topology of sharding, because as we mentioned in Taipei 4 months ago, that part might be the first bottleneck of the whole roadmap of implementation. So we can talk more tomorrow.
Please, you care. Hello. I have an answer from like 2 talkers ago. How are the clients written? And I'm curious if they have swappable components, for example, the VM. If we have some sort of interface, Pavel is doing work on this, Everett Hildenbrandt is doing work on this, to have VMs be swappable or even coexist. So then we're living at a level of abstraction that we can swap things in and out, so we're more flexible. So I'm just curious if we're thinking about doing things like this.
Yes, depending on how the client's designed, like some of these things are a lot more modular, or can be pretty modular, but like we're talking about total, like there are blocks and there are signatures, but like it's very, very different in terms of like the closest thing you have is that you're going to have like a computation engine, but you have a radically new landscape, and like using the same components will take some effort.
Yeah, I just want to mention that over at CBC Casperland, we have our own roadmap, and it's kind of not affected by things like advanced cryptography or the EVM. And we're kind of doing research, and we also pivot much less. We have like things that will never change, and that maybe, you know, if you worked on, wouldn't be something that you have to abandon later. But also, I can't promise that unless you're a researcher. And kind of like the way that I'm thinking about this is like, I guess like my plan is just continue working on the protocols and producing evidence that it's cool, and you know, producing like prototypes and eventually test nets and stuff, and then I'll try to like convince people to use them. I don't know how it fits into the rest of the roadmap, except for that I figured if there's Turing complete smart contracts, I'll be able to sidechain.